Stephen Curry had always been a man of discipline, precision, and focus. His talent on the basketball court had earned him millions of fans, endorsements, and accolades. But over time, as his fame grew, so did his curiosity. He had witnessed the way people treated him, and he began to wonder what would happen if they didn't know who I was. Would I still be treated with the same respect? Or would I be ignored, dismissed, or even looked down upon, like so many others in society who were marginalized and unseen? The idea came to him one evening, as he sat in the comfort of his luxurious home, flipping through social media on his phone. He had just returned from another charity event, where people had fawned over him, calling him a hero and a role model. It was the kind of attention he had grown accustomed to, but it was also the kind that began to feel somewhat hollow. He knew that there was more to life than the adoration of fans or the glow of endorsements. He needed to know what it felt like to be ordinary, to experience life from the perspective of someone who didn't have the luxury of celebrity. Thus, the idea was born. He would disguise himself, not as a rich man in hiding, but as someone who could easily be mistaken for a homeless person, a figure who would be dismissed, overlooked, and possibly even mistreated. And the best place to do this, he decided, was a local bank. The plan was simple. Curry would dress in clothes that made him look ragged, unkempt, and out of place. It wasn't enough to wear a single tattered shirt or a pair of old jeans. No, he needed to fully immerse himself in the experience. He needed to look like someone who had long given up on the superficial markers of status, someone who had been living on the streets for weeks, if not months. He borrowed a hoodie from a friend, one that was stained with grease and frayed at the edges. He picked out a pair of jeans that were torn at the knees, faded from years of wear. He smudged some dirt on his face to make it look like he hadn't had a proper wash in days. And to top it all off, he wore a baseball cap that was crumpled and stretched out of shape, concealing most of his hair and adding to the overall effect of someone who had given up on their appearance. But even in this disguise, he needed to be careful. There was no point in appearing too extreme or over the top. He didn't want to be pitied. He just wanted to blend in, to see how people treated him when they thought he was just another face in the crowd. He wanted to experience, if only for a few hours, the sense of invisibility that so many people living on the margins of society must feel every day. When the day of the experiment arrived, Curry set out early. He took a bus to the bank instead of driving, deliberately avoiding the usual comfort of his chauffeur car. The bus ride was uneventful, and he tried not to attract attention as he sat in the corner, staring out of the window, thinking about the nature of his plan. What would happen once he walked into that bank? Would the staff recognize him immediately, or would they simply see a homeless person? Would they offer him help, or would they avoid him altogether? He couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous anticipation as the bus approached his destination. He arrived at the bank just as the morning rush was beginning. It was a typical weekday, and the line of customers inside seemed to be moving at a steady pace. He stood in front of the entrance for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. This wasn't just a simple experiment, it was a chance to glimpse into the human condition, to see how people would react when faced with someone who was, in their eyes, of no consequence. With a deep breath, Curry pushed open the door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the air cool, sterile, and professional. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the room as a few customers stood in line, talking quietly amongst themselves. The tellers, dressed in neat suits, stood behind their counters, working efficiently. Curry could feel the eyes of the people around him flicker toward him, then quickly away. There was no acknowledgement, no recognition. For a brief moment, he felt like a ghost, standing in the middle of the room, unnoticed. He walked further inside, trying to act as naturally as possible. The employees behind the counters didn't look up at him. They were too absorbed in their tasks, sorting through paperwork, answering phones, and helping the customers who came before him. Curry stood near one of the service counters waiting. He was careful not to make any sudden movements, not to draw attention to himself. But it was clear that he was invisible to them. The experience was both liberating and unsettling. For the first time in his life, he wasn't someone to be admired or revered. He was just another man, standing alone in a public space, desperately hoping for someone to notice him. But no one did. It was as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the background. The bank, a place that was meant to serve people, seemed to be indifferent to his presence. and that indifference stung. As Curry stood there, watching the flow of people around him, he began to observe the subtle, often unconscious ways in which people interacted with him, or rather, didn't interact with him. When he shuffled slightly closer to the counter, hoping for a glance, he saw a woman standing in line, her arms crossed and her eyes scanning the room. She saw him, but there was no sign of recognition. She didn't move to offer assistance. She didn't ask if he needed help. Instead, she glanced away quickly, a slight frown forming on her face. There was a sense of discomfort, as though his presence bothered her in some way. Curry's heart began to race. The feeling of being seen as less than human was overwhelming. It was one thing to understand this intellectually, to hear about the plight of the homeless and marginalized. But it was something entirely different to feel it in his own skin, to experience firsthand what it was like to be ignored by those who were supposed to be there to help. He began to wonder, was this how everyone felt? Every single day he could hardly imagine what it must be like to wake up each morning and face the world with the knowledge that no one cared about you, that you were just another face to be passed by. His thoughts were interrupted as one of the bank tellers finally looked up from her desk and noticed him. But it wasn't a warm greeting. It wasn't a sign of kindness or concern. It was a look of disdain, the kind of look someone gives when they're irritated by an inconvenience. She rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath before turning away. In that moment, Stephen Curry realized the depth of his experiment's lesson. The disguise wasn't just about how others saw him, it was about how easily people could dismiss others based on appearance alone. The human capacity for judgment, for overlooking people who were perceived as different, was far more ingrained than he had ever imagined. As Stephen Curry stood in the middle of the bustling bank lobby, he couldn't shake the feeling of being utterly invisible. The smooth hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, and the low murmur of voices blended together in an almost hypnotic way. People moved around him, lost in their own worlds, absorbed in the quiet chaos of modern life. But no one paid him any attention. He was a ghost, a forgotten fragment of the background. The air inside the bank was chilled and clinical, the kind of sterile atmosphere that seemed to drain all warmth from human interaction. He shuffled a little to the side, closer to the counter where a teller was sorting through a stack of papers. She didn't look up. Not once. Her fingers danced over the paperwork, methodical and precise, her eyes trained on the task at hand. As if he weren't standing there at all. Stephen swallowed hard, a strange lump rising in his throat. The discomfort was real, almost suffocating. The world he had always known, the world where everyone recognized his face and called his name, had been replaced by a world where he was just another faceless person. He had prepared himself mentally for the possibility of being ignored, but the stark reality of it, the rawness of being overlooked, hit him harder than he had expected. A young man walked past him, his expensive suit rustling as he moved quickly toward the counter. He didn't even glance at Stephen. The man was absorbed in his phone, tapping away furiously, oblivious to anyone around him. The lack of awareness stung. Stephen's chest tightened. It wasn't just that people were ignoring him, they were actively choosing not to see him. He wasn't even a person in their eyes, he was a shadow, an inconvenience in the flow of their lives. Stephen took a deep breath and tried to steady his racing thoughts. It wasn't that he expected grand gestures of kindness or attention, but a simple acknowledgement would have sufficed. A glance, a smile, even a fleeting moment of human recognition. But instead, there was nothing. It was as if his very existence was irrelevant, an unimportant detail that didn't warrant a second thought. Across the room, he saw a woman approach one of the tellers. She was impeccably dressed, smart, confident, and composed. The teller greeted her with a warm smile, clearly recognizing her as a valued customer. Stephen couldn't help but notice the contrast. The teller's body language softened, her shoulders relaxed as she spoke with the woman, her voice smooth and welcoming. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. This was a person worthy of attention, worthy of being helped. The woman's smile grew wider as she spoke, and she leaned in slightly, as though she was sharing a secret with the teller. Stephen watched as the interaction unfolded, and a bitter taste began to form in the back of his mouth. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, the kind of respect that came with recognition. The world was always kind to him, it seemed, when they knew who he was. But here, in this moment, he wasn't Stephen Curry. He was just a man standing in a bank, blending in with the rest of the invisible people who passed through. It was a strange realization. He had known, of course, that there were people in the world who were marginalized, people who lived on the outskirts of society, people who were often treated with disdain. But now he was seeing it from a new perspective, feeling it in his own skin. The woman at the counter wasn't just receiving better treatment because she was a valued customer. She was receiving better treatment because of how she looked, how she presented herself. She was someone who had value in the eyes of the people around her. She was someone who mattered. Stephen's gaze shifted to another corner of the room, where a middle-aged man sat, waiting for his turn. His clothes were neat, but his posture was tired. He seemed to be in no rush, his face expressionless, as if he had been here 100 times before and knew the drill all too well. Stephen could almost feel the weight of the man's frustration. He had seen it in the faces of people before, the weariness, the resignation that comes from being in a system that is indifferent to your struggles. The man didn't seem to expect anything more from the bank. He knew that the service he would receive would be brief, transactional, and impersonal. He wasn't there to make connections, he was there because he had to be. The discomfort in Stephen's chest grew heavier. He began to feel like a part of the scenery, an extra in a film whose lines had been forgotten. A customer walked by him, a young woman with a coffee cup in hand, glancing over her shoulder as she passed. Their eyes met for a brief moment, an exchange that lasted no more than a fraction of a second. But in that instant, there was something in her gaze. It wasn't exactly kindness or recognition, but there was a certain softness, a fleeting moment of connection that cut through the cold, indifferent atmosphere. It was as if, for just that brief moment, she saw him. And it meant something, though Stephen wasn't sure what. He stood there for a while longer, watching as people came and went, each absorbed in their own world, each indifferent to the man standing in their midst. It was disorienting. He had always been someone who thrived in the spotlight, someone who was celebrated, admired, and often surrounded by a crowd. But here, he was nothing more than a passerby, someone who was easily ignored. It was as though his identity, the very thing that had defined his life for so long, no longer mattered. He began to notice the patterns more clearly now. The employees behind the counters moved with a practiced efficiency, their faces neutral, as though they had learned to treat every person the same, without judgment, but also without emotion. They didn't see the individual in front of them, they only saw the transaction, the task, the process. There was no room for connection, no room for warmth. The woman with the expensive dress received a warm smile because she fit into the world the tellers understood. She was someone they could easily categorize, someone who didn't upset the delicate balance of the system. But Stephen was different. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to be invisible. Yet here he was, feeling the weight of his own anonymity. It was a paradox, a strange and painful realization. The deeper he thought about it, the more it troubled him. How many people walked into places like this every day, only to be overlooked, ignored, and treated as though they didn't matter? How many of them had the strength to keep going, to persist in a world that seemed determined to forget them? Stephen shifted uneasily, his mind racing. The first impression had been made, and it was one he would never forget. The invisible man standing alone in a room full of people, wondering how long it would take before anyone noticed him, not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. As Stephen stood in the crowded lobby of the bank, the weight of his disguise began to settle on him. It wasn't just the baggy, worn clothes or the unkempt beard that made him feel out of place. It was the strange sense of being unimportant. The longer he stood there, the more the world around him seemed to fade into a blur. The hum of conversation, the rustling of papers, the quiet clink of coins, all of it became background noise, a soundtrack to the surreal experience he was living. He wasn't just an observer, he was a subject in a social experiment. An unknown man amid strangers who would treat him based on the appearance he had carefully crafted. He took a slow, measured breath and forced himself to focus. A few minutes passed, though they felt longer, and Stephen noticed a shift in the way the bank employees moved. They were still efficient, still absorbed in their tasks, but now a sense of distance, of cold professionalism, surrounded him. It wasn't just that they didn't offer to help him. It was the way they barely acknowledged his presence, the way they actively avoided looking his direction. They were working, but they weren't seeing. There was something unsettling about the way the room seemed to close in on him. He waited for a while, standing in the midst of the ebb and flow of customers. As he glanced around, he could see the small interactions that took place, brief exchanges between a teller and a customer, polite nods, the exchange of documents and signatures. Every one of these exchanges was marked by recognition. The teller smiled at the man with the neatly pressed suit. He made small talk with the elderly woman who seemed to know the bank staff by name. There was warmth, a shared humanity in those fleeting moments. But none of that warmth was extended to him. Stephen was just another face in the sea of others, a body that didn't matter. Then, as if by instinct, he began to walk. It wasn't fast, nor was it slow, just a steady movement forward, as though he were inching closer to something he wasn't sure would happen. His eyes scanned the counters ahead, each one occupied by a teller, and he instinctively knew that he would have to speak up, to break the silence of his invisibility. He tried not to overthink it. The bank employees had already dismissed him without a second glance, and his interaction with them was going to be the tipping point of his entire experiment. How would they treat him now, once he finally approached them? As he moved closer to the counter, he could feel his heart rate increase. It wasn't the pressure of being recognized, it wasn't about fame or the spotlight. It was the fear of being rejected, of being ignored so thoroughly that it would almost be painful. What would they do when he got close enough to speak? Would they continue to look past him? Would they engage, but only out of obligation? Or would they finally see the person behind the disguise, the man who was more than just a filthy exterior? The counter in front of him was occupied by a young woman. She was focused, her fingers moving swiftly across the keys of her computer, her eyes glued to the screen as though the world around her had faded away. She wore a crisp blue blouse, and her dark hair was neatly pulled back. There was nothing remarkable about her, except for the invisible wall she seemed to have erected around herself. She was another one of those employees, Stephen thought, who had become so conditioned to look only at the task at hand that she had ceased to see the people standing in front of her. He couldn't help but notice how rigid her posture was, how she seemed almost too comfortable in her indifference. It was as if she had constructed her own reality, one where no one outside her immediate scope of focus existed. She wasn't rude. She wasn't overtly dismissive. She was simply indifferent. He cleared his throat, a deliberate sound meant to capture her attention. It was a soft noise, but enough to break the silence of his corner of the bank. Her eyes flicked upward for a brief moment, barely acknowledging his presence. The faintest of frowns appeared on her face, as if she were momentarily inconvenienced by the interruption. Her gaze quickly shifted back to the computer screen, her fingers still typing. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply continued with her work. Stephen stood there, frozen in the awkward space between them. This wasn't how he had imagined it would go. He had thought that there might be some curiosity, some flicker of recognition at the very least. He expected some baseline level of human decency. But instead, he was met with a wall of indifference. It was as if he wasn't even a person. He was just a disruption in her otherwise perfect day. The minutes seemed to stretch on as he waited. Every second felt like an eternity, his sense of isolation deepening with each passing moment. It was difficult to describe the feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was a heavy, hollow sensation, a recognition of just how much of society's attention was reserved for those deemed worthy of it. And he, in this moment, was not worthy. He tried again, this time louder. "Excuse me, can you help me?" he asked, his voice thick with the uncertainty of someone who wasn't used to being dismissed. The woman looked up again, her expression unreadable. This time, her gaze lingered a fraction longer, as though she was just now realizing that he was standing there. There was no surprise in her eyes, no genuine curiosity, only a faint flicker of discomfort, as though he had interrupted her in a way she wasn't prepared for. She opened her mouth, and for a brief second, Stephen thought she might say something. But she hesitated, her lips forming words that didn't come out. Instead, she turned to the side, calling to another employee, "I'll be with you in a second." It wasn't the coldness of the words that stung, it was the disinterest. It was the complete lack of empathy in her voice. Stephen had expected to be treated with at least a basic level of respect, even if he wasn't immediately recognized. But in that moment he understood something fundamental. He wasn't even human enough to warrant politeness. To her, he was just a nuisance, a distraction from her real work. He could have left then. He could have walked out, taking his lesson with him and never looking back. But there was something else inside him, something that pushed him forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was a need to be seen, to be acknowledged. Or maybe it was just the simple human desire for connection. Whatever it was, Stephen couldn't turn away now. He had come this far. He took another step closer to the counter, this time leaning slightly toward the young woman, making sure she could hear him. "I really need some help," he said, his voice more insistent now. At last she turned her head, her eyes briefly meeting his, but only long enough to register that he was there. "I'll be with you shortly," she repeated, her tone flat and unfeeling. Without waiting for him to respond, she turned back to her computer, effectively dismissing him once more. Stephen's heart sank. He had spent so long imagining how this moment would unfold, but nothing could have prepared him for the realization that he was not just being ignored, he was being actively shut out. It was as if his very presence had become an inconvenience. He stood there, caught in the limbo of being seen but not acknowledged, of trying to break through the invisible walls that had been erected around him. And yet, there was something deeper in this moment, something Stephen could not shake. It wasn't just about being ignored in the bank. It was about how easy it was for people to forget each other, to dismiss others without a second thought. It was about the walls that society built, the walls that made it so simple to pass by people and pretend they weren't there. In that moment, Stephen Curry wasn't just a man in a disguise. He was the embodiment of every person who had ever been ignored, overlooked, or dismissed. Stephen stood motionless in front of the counter, the harsh fluorescent light casting a cold glow on his face. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the alienating isolation he felt. The young teller, still absorbed in her work, had not so much as acknowledged his presence beyond the initial glance. His mind swirled with a chaotic mix of emotions: disappointment, confusion, and something deeper, something unsettling. It wasn't just that he had been ignored. It was that he had been erased. In that brief exchange, or lack thereof, he had felt the full weight of invisibility. The sense of being a ghost, drifting through a world of people who didn't care enough to see him, to recognize his humanity. In the quiet, sterile space of the bank, time seemed to stretch and contract, bending in ways that made Stephen acutely aware of his own stillness. He wasn't just waiting for the teller to speak to him. He was waiting for something more, a gesture, a flicker of empathy, something that would bridge the gap between him and the indifferent world around him. But it never came. The seconds dragged on, his frustration building with each passing moment, and yet, beneath it all, there was a strange sense of clarity beginning to emerge. As he stood there, he started to think about how easy it had been for him to dismiss the experiences of others, those who had to navigate life in the margins, who were treated as less than, who were overlooked in the same way he had just been. Before this moment, Stephen had been aware of the societal disparities, of the ways in which people could be judged based on their appearance, their social status, their race, or their wealth. But he had never truly felt it, not in the visceral, painful way he was feeling it now. It was an intellectual understanding before, a notion that lived in the abstract. Now, it was a raw, living truth, cutting through him like a shard of glass. He had always been the one people noticed, the one who had doors open for him, who had the world at his feet. But now, in this moment, in these ragged clothes and unshaven face, he was nothing. And it was a reality he could no longer ignore. He thought back to the moments when he had walked into a room and felt the eyes of everyone on him. The recognition, the admiration, the unspoken acknowledgement of his success, his status. It was a feeling he had grown accustomed to, one he had almost come to expect. But now, as he stood in the bank, invisible to everyone around him, he understood something that had eluded him for years. It wasn't just about the fame. It wasn't just about the accolades. It was about the privilege of being seen, of being humanized. He had taken that privilege for granted. The longer he stood there, the more he realized how rarely people, especially those at the margins of society, had that privilege. How many individuals walked through spaces like this, hoping for help, but were instead treated with suspicion, disdain, or indifference? How many were ignored, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because they didn't fit into the neat little boxes society had created for those deemed worthy of attention? How many had been made to feel like they didn't exist at all? Stephen closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the realization settle in. The air in the bank seemed to press against him, thick with the tension of unspoken judgments. He thought about the homeless, the ones who wandered through the streets with no shelter, no refuge. The ones who sat outside stores or on street corners, their faces gaunt and hollow, their bodies thin from lack of food, their clothes ragged and worn. He thought about how people would often avoid eye contact with them, or even cross the street to avoid the discomfort of seeing them. He thought about how many of those people had been once just like him, people who had dreams, ambitions, and hopes, people who had stories, who had lived lives full of moments and memories, only to be reduced to nothing more than a nuisance to be ignored. What made him different from them? His fame? His wealth? His basketball skills? But beyond those superficial layers, he was still the same as they were. He still had emotions. He still felt pain, love, and sorrow. He still had thoughts and dreams. Yet in the eyes of the bank employees, he was just another person, one of many not worth a second glance. And the truth was, in some ways, he had always seen the world through the lens of his own privilege. He had never truly understood the depth of the divide, the chasm that separated those who were seen and those who were invisible. Now, he was being forced to confront it. The more he reflected, the more a sense of guilt began to gnaw at him. Not for participating in the experiment itself, but for having lived a life where he had never fully questioned the systems that allowed him to be treated differently. He had walked through the world with a sense of entitlement, thinking that his worth was intrinsic, that it was deserved. But now, standing in this cold, impersonal space, he realized that no one should have to prove their worthiness for respect. No one should have to fight for basic human dignity. And yet, for so many, that was the daily struggle. For so many, the struggle wasn't about achieving greatness or wealth or fame. It was about simply being seen, being acknowledged as a person deserving of basic recognition. As his thoughts drifted back to the teller, Stephen couldn't help but wonder what had shaped her behavior. Was it the culture of the bank? The sterile, impersonal environment where transactions took precedence over human connection? Or was it something deeper, something ingrained in society that taught people to view others as lesser, as disposable, based solely on their appearance or social status? He had no answers, but he had a growing sense of urgency, a need to understand this dynamic, this cold distance between people. He had spent years in the public eye, treated like a star, a hero, someone worth listening to. But in this moment, in this bank, he was faced with the reality of what so many people faced every day, a world where their stories didn't matter, where their struggles were ignored, and where they were relegated to the margins. Stephen opened his eyes, looking around the bank once more. The world seemed unchanged, but he was different now. He was no longer just a spectator. He was living in the very thing he had always heard about. He was experiencing it firsthand. The discomfort, the hurt, the realization that no one owes anyone anything, yet kindness is so easily forgotten. He wanted to say something. He wanted to do something. He wanted to grab the young teller by the shoulders and shake her out of her apathy, to make her see the people she had been conditioned to overlook. But there was a strange irony in that thought. He, too, had been part of the problem, had perpetuated the idea of worth based on external markers, rather than the intrinsic value of a human being. In that quiet moment, Stephen realized that his experiment had become more than just an exploration of the human tendency to judge based on appearances. It had become a mirror, one that reflected back the uncomfortable truths he had been avoiding for so long. He wasn't just learning about society, he was learning about himself. The lesson, harsh as it was, had planted a seed in his mind. It wasn't just about seeing others, it was about how he saw them, how he had the responsibility to treat everyone with the same humanity he expected for himself. This moment of reflection, painful as it was, had changed something in him. It had opened his eyes to a truth he could never unsee. As Stephen continued to stand there, the weight of the moment began to settle on him like an immovable force. The subtle hum of the bank's climate-controlled air, the soft click of keyboards, the hushed voices of distant conversations, it all felt far away now, like the backdrop of a play in which he had forgotten his lines. He had been ignored, dismissed, reduced to the background, and with every passing second, that fact seemed to etch itself deeper into his mind. The more he thought about it, the more the truth started to crystallize. It wasn't just the bank, it wasn't just the employees, this was the world. And somehow, in that moment, the harsh reality of human indifference made itself known to him in a way it never had before. It was a strange kind of awakening, one that seemed to strip away all the comfort and safety that he had come to rely on. Stephen had spent years in the spotlight, living in a world where his success, his wealth, and his fame were not just noticed but celebrated. He was used to being sought after, recognized, revered. But now he was just another face in the crowd, a face no one bothered to look at twice, and one that seemed to mean nothing to the people who passed him by. He wasn't just overlooked because of his appearance, his disheveled clothes, or his unshaven face. He was overlooked because, in this world, there was a strange and unforgiving hierarchy of worth, a system that valued people based on external markers, wealth, status, appearance, while dismissing those who didn't fit into those narrow boxes. A bitter taste formed in the back of his throat as the full force of the realization hit him. He wasn't just seeing society for what it was. He was feeling it in the pit of his stomach, in his chest, in the very marrow of his bones. The truth was undeniable now. People weren't treated equally, no matter how hard they tried to make it seem that way. The world was built on layers of invisible walls, each one separating the haves from the have-nots, the seen from the unseen. And the worst part was that, until this moment, Stephen had never really seen it. He had been blind to the way society worked, to the systems of exclusion that dictated who mattered and who didn't. He thought back to all the times he had encountered the homeless, the ones who stood outside stadiums or lingered near alleyways, their eyes hollow, their clothes tattered. He had never given them more than a passing glance, his attention distracted by the next game, the next endorsement, the next opportunity. To him, they had always been part of the background noise, like the litter on the streets, the occasional sight of a stray dog, or the distant hum of traffic. He had never stopped to think about their stories. He had never questioned why they were there or who had failed them. He had never bothered to wonder about the world that had discarded them. Now, however, everything had changed. It was like a veil had been lifted, and in its place, the stark reality of human suffering, isolation, and neglect stood before him. In his carefully curated life of luxury and fame, he had lived in a bubble, oblivious to the lives of people who struggled daily just to survive. He had never realized how easy it was to ignore people, to erase them from existence, to make them invisible. Until now, he had never understood the depth of the loneliness that came from being overlooked. And now that he understood it, it was almost unbearable. It wasn't just about the homeless. It wasn't just about the people living on the streets or the ones who wore ragged clothes and had no fixed address. It was about everyone who had ever been judged for their appearance or dismissed because they didn't fit the mold. It was about the elderly woman who was treated with condescension in a store simply because she didn't speak English well. It was about the immigrant who had to fight for recognition, to prove their worthiness in a world that told them they were other. It was about the young man in a hoodie, entering a store whose mere presence made the security guard suspicious, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. It was about the single mother, working multiple jobs, who was given no grace when she walked into a bank to ask for a loan, only to be turned away because of her credit score. It was about all those people who, in one way or another, had been told that they didn't matter. Stephen's chest tightened as these thoughts consumed him. He had always thought of himself as a good person. He had done charity work, he had donated to causes, he had helped kids. But what he had failed to realize was that there was a vast difference between doing good and understanding. He had been living a life of detached kindness, where he helped others in a way that allowed him to feel good about himself, but without ever fully grasping the depth of the suffering he was alleviating. He had been part of the system without realizing how deeply entrenched he was in it. It was like a person walking through a field of thorns and feeling the occasional scratch, but never stopping to question the pain that others were enduring all around them. He looked at the teller again, this time not with resentment or anger, but with a new understanding. She was a product of the same system. She had grown up in a world that taught her to see some people as worthy of her attention and others as disposable. She wasn't inherently bad or cruel. She was simply a cog in a much larger machine that had trained her to ignore certain types of people, people who didn't look like her, people who didn't belong to her social class, people who were on the fringes of society. She wasn't the enemy. The system was, and Stephen had been a part of it, just like everyone else. It was a humbling realization, one that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world and his place in it. He had always believed that success came from hard work, from perseverance, from playing the game right. And that might have been true for him. But for so many others, the game was rigged from the start. There were no second chances. There were no underdogs who rose up through sheer determination. There was only a cold, indifferent system that decided who mattered based on arbitrary rules and outdated biases. Stephen took a slow breath, his mind racing with the enormity of what he had just uncovered. For the first time in his life, he felt small. He felt powerless. The world he had once dominated seemed so much larger now, so much more complicated. It wasn't about basketball anymore. It wasn't about the championships or the contracts or the endorsement deals. It was about something far more significant: the human condition. It was about the silent suffering of those who had been pushed to the edges of society, who were told every day that they were invisible, that they were less than. The realization was a heavy burden to bear, but it was also a spark, an awakening. And with that spark, a new fire began to burn inside of him. He couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't unlearn what he had learned. The world would never be the same, and neither would he. He knew that the path forward would be complicated, that there was no easy solution, no quick fix. But for the first time in his life, he understood the importance of seeing people not just as they appeared on the surface, but as the complex, hurting, beautiful humans that they were. He had been given the privilege of recognition, of being seen. And it was his responsibility to use that privilege to make the world a little less indifferent, a little more compassionate, a little more human. The moments following Stephen's realization felt like a delicate, fragile pause in time. The bank lobby, with its sleek modernity and sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere, seemed to blur around him. People moved through the space, passing him by in an endless stream. Some were absorbed in their phones, others speaking in low tones with bank employees, but none of them spared him more than a passing glance. To them, he was just another anonymous figure, a face they would never remember, an invisible presence they would soon forget. But for Stephen, it felt different. He was no longer merely observing the world from the outside, as he had done for years. He was now a participant in something far greater than his own experiences. A truth that had previously been abstract and distant now lay before him in sharp, undeniable focus. The world was a place where value was often assigned based on surface-level judgments on the clothes you wore, the car you drove, the job you held. It was a world where people were categorized, labeled, and dismissed with a frightening ease, depending on their perceived worth. It was a world where empathy was sometimes a luxury, and the most basic human decency was so often withheld from those who were seen as unimportant. Stephen's thoughts drifted to his childhood. Growing up in a world that valued athletes, where skill and success could elevate someone from obscurity to fame, he had always felt that he understood the struggles of others. He had come from humble beginnings, after all. His family had worked hard to make ends meet, and he had always been aware of the sacrifices his parents made for him. He had learned early on to appreciate the value of hard work, of perseverance, of pushing through adversity. But there was a difference between experiencing hardship and truly understanding it. His childhood struggles had been fleeting, transient. They had been part of his narrative, part of the story that propelled him toward his dreams. Now, standing in the bank, the difference became painfully clear. His hardships had been temporary, fleeting. But for many people, adversity was a constant companion. It wasn't a phase they grew out of, but a permanent fixture in their lives. People who were homeless, struggling with mental health issues, or battling systemic inequalities didn't have the luxury of dreaming of a better life. They were trapped in their circumstances, often unseen and unheard, as if their lives didn't matter at all. And Stephen had been blind to that reality, not out of malice, but out of sheer ignorance. The realization struck him like a tidal wave. He had been privileged his entire life, not just because of his fame, his wealth, or his accomplishments, but because of the very fact that people had always seen him. He had been seen for his skills, for his status, for the value he brought to the table. But what about those who weren't seen? What about the people who walked through the world unnoticed, whose value wasn't measured by their success or appearance? What about the invisible ones? The more Stephen thought about it, the more he understood that he had been part of the problem, even if unintentionally. He had been complicit in a system that valued some lives more than others, that rewarded people for fitting a certain mold while disregarding those who didn't. He had spent so much of his life chasing external validation that he had never truly questioned the fundamental inequities in the world around him. But now, standing there in the cold, impersonal bank, he felt the profound weight of that truth. And with it came a powerful lesson, one that would forever change the way he saw the world, and more importantly, the way he saw the people in it. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge these inequalities. Stephen realized that he had to actively fight against them. He had to challenge the systems that perpetuated them, whether in small, everyday interactions or on a larger, societal level. He had to be part of a movement that didn't just make room for the successful but actively sought to give dignity and value to the unsuccessful, to those who didn't have the power, the wealth, or the recognition that so many others took for granted. The change had to start with him, and it had to start now. The first step was recognizing that everyone mattered, regardless of their station in life, the color of their skin, the clothes they wore, or the amount of money in their bank account. This was the most basic truth Stephen had learned. It was the cornerstone of everything he now understood about empathy and compassion. If he could truly see people for who they were, not for the labels society had placed on them, not for their wealth or their appearance, then he could start to break down the barriers that separated him from them. He could start to humanize the people who had been dehumanized for so long. But this lesson wasn't just about abstract ideas. It was about action. It was about changing the way he interacted with the world, about using his platform, his influence, and his resources to make a tangible difference. For years, he had used his fame to sell products, to build his brand, to entertain millions. But now Stephen realized that he had a far greater responsibility to use his position to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. He had a responsibility to use his influence to raise awareness about the struggles faced by the disenfranchised, to challenge the societal structures that perpetuated inequality, and to help build a world where every person, regardless of their circumstances, was seen and treated with dignity. Stephen's heart swelled with a new sense of purpose. He could feel the weight of the lesson, heavy, unyielding, but necessary. It wasn't going to be easy. The systems of inequality were vast and deeply entrenched. But he wasn't going to sit idly by anymore. He wasn't going to be part of a world that chose to ignore the suffering of others. He was going to fight to make a difference, no matter how small, no matter how incremental. He thought back to the teller, the one who had looked at him with disinterest, who had dismissed him because he didn't fit the mold of a typical customer. He didn't feel anger toward her anymore. Instead, he felt sadness, a deep sorrow for how society had conditioned her and so many others to treat people like him as invisible. She wasn't inherently bad, and neither was anyone else in that bank. They were products of a system that valued surface-level accomplishments and ignored the inherent worth of every individual, and it was that system that needed to change. Stephen took a deep breath and made a silent vow to himself. This was just the beginning. The lesson he had learned in the bank was going to shape the rest of his life. He would use his voice, his platform, and his resources to fight for those who had been left behind. He would be a part of the solution, not the problem. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be moments of doubt, but Stephen knew one thing for sure: he would never again look at the world the same way. He had been given the powerful gift of understanding, and with that understanding came an even greater responsibility. From this moment forward, Stephen Curry would be more than a basketball player, more than a celebrity. He would be a force for change, a force that sought to dismantle the systems of exclusion and build a world where every person, no matter their background, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. And in that pursuit, he knew that the journey would be long, but it would be worth every step.